All about China COVID protests. China has been in the news lately for their COVID protests. Protesters in several major Chinese cities expressed their anger over the country's stringent zero-COVID policy, under which cities were put on lockdown over just a handful of coronavirus cases. This was the biggest wave of demonstrations since the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. Creating an unprecedented challenge for President Xi Jinping and prompting some relaxation of the measures. The catalyst was ignited at the Foxconn factory in Shenzhou, which manufactures iPhones, on 22nd of November. Hundreds of workers demonstrated to denounce tight lockdown measures as well as the non-payment of bonuses. Anger over China's zero-COVID policy had already reached a boiling point, but this was all it took for the protest movement to spread like wildfire across numerous cities. After 3 years of enforcing a zero-COVID policy, China is seeking to reverse course in the face of widespread protests that have been going on for nearly 2 weeks. As officials implement policy reforms, new concerns have emerged regarding the role of protests in this shift, the government's susceptibility to popular pressure, and what to expect from future protests in China. So, what did the protests against the zero-COVID policy accomplish? At first glance, it may appear that the central government's abrupt policy shift is a direct outcome of the widespread protests. The people received what they demanded, a return to relative normalcy. However, despite the fact that the government has abandoned its punitive approach to COVID-19, official media have avoided reporting demonstrators' demands. Instead, it has attributed the shift to other causes, such as a weaker strain of the virus and the success of China's 3-year campaign. So, did the protests lead to the termination of zero-COVID? The simple answer is that they were probably not the primary deciding factor, but they did contribute to the government's quick decision. Economic concerns appear to have played a role in the decision as well. Following the 20th Party Congress in mid-November, the government sought to relax some COVID-19 restrictions, but it quickly returned to rigorous control measures as cases increased. Because of the policy changes' effects on new hires' wages and benefits, Foxconn workers organized a large protest. Terry Gao, founder of Foxconn and one of China's biggest foreign investors, sent a letter to the Chinese leadership warning that its policies were hurting China's global supply chains. This came on top of pessimistic economic news, showing a slowing of economic growth. But what was special about protests this time in comparison to previous COVID-related protests in China? This wave of protests is different because it is directly against the zero-COVID policy of the central government. Although Chinese academians, citizen journalists, and activists have previously pointed out shortcomings in the policy, the majority of public criticism had previously targeted local governments' implementation of it. This time, though, the protesters demanded the cancellation of zero-COVID and challenged the central government more directly. It is also worth noting the worldwide mobilization of protests. Chinese citizens in major cities throughout the world, including New York, London, Berlin, and Paris, held memorials and protests to raise awareness and demonstrate support with Chinese demonstrators. This follows a similar incident in October, just prior to the 21st Party Congress, when a man on the Strong Bridge in Beijing unfurled a banner asking for Chinese leader Xi Jinping to resign, provoking international vigils and protests. Most notably, people in Shanghai went to Urumqi Road, prompting the government to remove the street signs. Some expressed online that what is allowed to happen to a small population of Chinese people today would eventually affect everyone. So let's talk about the noteworthy strategies used in these protests. Because the protesters were familiar with a type of encrypted connection known as virtual private network, they were able to circumvent internet censorship and access international social media sites such as Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram to coordinate and mobilize rallies. Another notable tactic was the adoption of a symbol, in this case, a blank A4 sheet of paper, as a humorous response to China's strict censorship and surveillance. It was inspired in part by Hong Kong protesters in 2020 who held blank papers in order to avoid the national security law that criminalized pro-democracy shouts. The A4 paper, which was once the normal paper size in China, is now used as a symbol of free speech and press in Chinese protests. Some have dubbed the protests the A4 Revolution. So, what do these protests say about the future of protests in China? The result of this wave of protests, although uncertain, is encouraging for many Chinese people. Many of them saw the severe civil society crackdown over the past decade, leaving little space for public expression. The protests serve as evidence that despite harsh censorship and crackdown, Chinese people can use creative tools to make their voices heard. China's youth are both the direct beneficiary of China's economic development and the most affected by its slowing economy, competitive job market, and zero-COVID policy. Their growing disillusionment with the government's promise of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation could shape the future of protests. In addition, their difficulty accessing information about past protests and crackdowns in China ironically allows them to be bolder and less fearful of potential consequences. The Chinese diaspora's involvement also suggests that future protests could receive transnational participation. As information access becomes more difficult inside of China due to the hardened censorship, the Chinese diaspora could continue to function as a nexus for information flow and international solidarity for Chinese domestic movements. Over the past 25 years, the Chinese government has successfully diffused mass protests. The end of zero-COVID protests may be just another example of government appeasing the public by fulfilling selective demands that align with the government's interests. But it is also possible that future protests in China will make broader demands for civil rights. Although in the recent protests most people focused on specific COVID-related demands, many had larger goals in mind. A return to a relatively open society, where intellectual debates and civil activism coexisted with economic development. If people keep making these demands, the government's usual strategy to distract and diffuse might eventually become insufficient to appease public unrest. China is rapidly opening up after years of its zero-COVID policy, with strict lockdowns, mandatory testing, and major travel restrictions. But the major policy shift could pose further complications in China as people resume international travel and geopolitically as a patchwork of countries impose restrictions on Chinese air travelers. The US, the UK, Italy, India, Israel, Spain, Canada, South Korea, and France are all implementing some form of restriction on air travel from China. That typically means a passenger embarking in China and heading to one of these countries can't board without a negative test, or, in Spain's case, without being vaccinated. But policies surrounding infectious diseases are hard to make without accurate data about caseloads, hospitalizations, and deaths, which China has failed to collect and disseminate since rolling back zero-COVID in late December. It's much too early to tell exactly what effect the policy shift will have, though China appears to be experiencing a major wave of infections presently that hasn't translated into major infections outside the country. But because Chinese air travelers haven't gone through multiple variant waves, they could be more vulnerable to infection. In the month since, the set of policies Xi once said prioritized the people and their lives above all else has swiftly crumbled, leaving in its wake a significant rise in cases and a strained healthcare system. Though the world is better equipped to manage COVID-19 than in 2020, the patchwork of restrictions in response to China's reopening still shows major flaws in the world's ability to deal with the pandemic in a united, consistent manner. COVID-19 is likely to be endemic for years to come. Incidents like China's reopening and the potential for new disease variants and waves should be a reminder of the importance of global health, vaccine equity, and partnerships in proactive public health interventions. Thanks for watching our video on the recent COVID-19 protests in China. It's been interesting to see the public's response to the stringent lockdown measures that have been implemented in the country, and it will be worth keeping an eye on how the situation develops in the coming days and weeks. As always, we welcome your comments and feedback, so please feel free to leave a message in the comments section below. Until next time, take care and stay safe.